Today marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, one of the most significant, deadliest events for the Americans in World War II. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Rob Citino, the former Executive Director here at the museum and a distinguished fellow, also an honored military historian and the author of 11 books. So, Rob, thanks for joining us today.
Mike, it's always great to be with you, even if digitally. I miss New Orleans on occasion. Rainy, cold day here in Cleveland.
Well, speaking of rainy, cold days, let's dive right into the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944, Rob, kind of help us kind of set the stage here, particularly from the German perspective of, what is Hitler hoping to achieve here? We can talk a bit about how this plays into the Allies' assumptions about how the war is going to go.
Yeah, so I think probably to begin discussing the Bulge, you have to go back to the D-Day landing. Hitler had told anyone who would listen that our last chance of winning this war is to stop the Allies and their landing in Western Europe. And it happened in June 6th. The Atlantic Wall got punctured in numerous places within the first 24 hours. There was tough fighting for weeks in Normandy, but eventually a massive Allied breakout. The German armies in Normandy were destroyed, the remnants of them hightailing it, we might say, back to Germany at top speed, one of the great pursuit marches of all time, General Patton's Third Army across northern France. And things looked great for the Allies, and things couldn't have looked more dire for the Germans. But, sometime at the end of the summer, early September, it was clear that the Allies were running out of gas. I mean that figuratively, but I also mean it literally. And that the Germans were getting that, that classic second wind that so often happens in campaigns. One side seems to have it all their way, and then their momentum flags, and the adversary kind of falls back on his supply bases and begins to reestablish himself. That had happened in September and October, right along the German border, so-called Siegfried Line. The Allies still were feeling pretty good. They had some dreams maybe of ending this war by Christmas. The Germans, feeling pretty bad. They'd taken their lumps in Normandy. We should never underestimate the depths of that defeat. But somehow they'd managed to coalesce, and at least their feet were under them again. And it was Hitler, really, but his staff as well, reminding each other that, look, no one ever wins a war successfully defending in place. You're going to have to launch some kind of offensive blow against our adversaries. They had two. They had a Western and an Eastern front. They decided to go with the West, thinking a victory there would splinter the Anglo-American alliance. At the very least, the Western allies would have to fall back and give them a breathing space to turn and deal in some indefinite way with the Soviet Union. So for many years of my career, I couldn't understand this. What did the Germans think they were doing by wasting their last reserves, really, in this great offensive against largely the Americans? But I don't know. I've come around the more I think about it. They were going to have to do something. Surrender was out of the question because Hitler would not allow that. And frankly, no one in the army was arguing for it either at that point. But you don't win wars by sitting successfully on the defensive. You lose them more slowly, I suppose. The Germans typically, as is the history of the Prussian German army, went for a big solution. They were going to launch one last great offensive. Mike, I put it this way. If you don't think the Germans were going to launch one last great offensive, you haven't really been paying attention to their military history over the last few centuries, really.
No, you can see it that way because on one level, we know how the battle turns out.
We have 100%, after the fact, ex post facto, everything looks explainable and obvious. I'm concerned that in our discussions about World War II, not the two of us, but generally, people seem more and more to be along the lines of, it all worked out inevitably. Nothing was inevitable about World War II. Not one single occurrence, not one single day could you say inevitability took place. Maybe after Hitler shot himself, then things are inevitable. The Third Reich had lost the war, but I can't say I'm a Clausewitzian, that I follow the teachings of Clausewitz and that it's, war is the domain of fog and friction and unpredictability, and then, turn around and claim that World War II was inevitable, or that indeed German defeat in the Battle of the Bulge was inevitable. Didn't look that way the first few days.
No, and certainly it has its share of fog and friction. Briefly, though, let me kind of unpack even the Allied assumptions, because as you mentioned, many of the Allies thought, hey, the war's going to be over by Christmas. The Germans have had it. The intel assessments at every level said, the Germans no longer have the capacity for anything other than local counterattacks, despite evidence to the contrary. You see German force build up, 6th Panzer Army, for instance. The assumption is these would just be for local counterattacks. And so it's interesting how the German deception plan plays into the Allied preconceptions.
Every single intelligence officer is kind of echoing every other single intelligence officer. And there isn't a consensus that is coming across Eisenhower's desk that the Germans are through when it comes to major offensives. We now know today that there were some reports and there were some perceptive folks in the intelligence community who said, no, I wouldn't be so quick to say that. But do you want to be the one that brings that contrary report to Eisenhower's desk when everybody else is certain that the Germans are kind of toast? I think, I've never been in a staff meeting, Mike. I'll say that outright. But I know enough about human nature to know that when there's a consensus, standing up against the consensus and saying, I think everyone in this room might be wrong, and you're bringing bad news to the boss. I know that can be very, very difficult. And I think it's an intelligence issue. I think it's also an issue of human nature. Hopes had been raised so high by the events at the end of the summer of 1944. It looked like the war was going to be over by Christmas, that classic formulation. And now, it's December and the weather's horrible and it's cold and you're shivering out in some slit trench or some foxhole somewhere on the front line along the Siegfried line. And, morale's pretty low. And I think it's just very, very difficult to make it any lower by saying, you know what, I think we're really in trouble here. And as that's one reason I think why no one said that, even some of those who thought it might be true.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, as the remnants of the German force, fall into Germany and they're remobilizing, these new Volksgrenadier divisions and, assembling Panzer tanks, you no longer need your ultra communications that the Allies had really banked so much on about German intentions. That they're no longer radioing their units; they're just calling them on the telephone or sending a runner, and so the absence of reporting in that case wasn't seen as a challenge, but just confirmed their perspectives. And so, and to your point about many of these units are ground out. The 28th Division that's really going to be right along the road to Bastogne, they're coming out of the Hurtgen Forest and they need 6,000 replacements. I mean, talk about some serious combat. The 4th Infantry Division, major, combat, since Utah Beach. And the idea is we're going to put them in this quiet sector and, bring in, replacements. So not only are we not expecting a major German attack, but we certainly aren't expecting it in the Ardennes.
Yeah, so there's two different kinds of surprise there, Mike. I guess strategic is the one. Are they going to attack or aren't they? Well, no one thinks they will, and they do. And the other one is the more tactical side. It was like, well, where will they attack? Well, they certainly won't attack here. And of course they do. I think a couple of phrases should probably be banned from the military lexicon. We're going to be home by Christmas. Anytime your officers tell you that, you should all run the other way. And the other one will be, this is a quiet sector of the front. Because modern war being what it is, a quiet sector of the front can erupt into fire at any moment. And that is precisely what happened to some of those divisions in the Ardennes. Yes, it is an unlikely place that, because all militaries try to achieve surprise on their adversary. If they're not, they're really missing the boat. And it's just there's a few. Someday you and I can sit down and we'll put together the list of things you should never say to your troops in war. But one of them, don't worry, guys, this is a quiet sector of the front. Nothing is ever going to happen here, might be one of them.
Yeah, and then, as the 106th Division comes into the line, does a relief in place with the 2nd Infantry Division, so they hear some, German vehicle movement and, oh, don't worry about that. You're new. That's just normal. And so
those poor guys, you mentioned the 106th, and they get a lot of, they're targets of the opening invasion. They get hit pretty hard. But these guys had just arrived in the theater. They had just arrived in France a couple of weeks before, is my understanding, and had been rushed up to the front. And, were just really kind of shaking themselves out into what you might consider a battle array. And you're right. Someone saying, well, what is that crazy noise we're hearing all night? It sounds like heavy equipment being moved, which, of course, it was. Artillery and tanks. And quite, that's exactly what you just said. People said, oh, you just got here. You'll get used to it. Everybody spooked their first few days in the line. And of course, those guys were, they were hearing what they were hearing, as everyone would soon find out.
Well, and their conditions are pretty dire. They're soaking wet as they move up through France. They come into line, 2nd Infantry Division, which is moving north for the Ruhr campaign. They do relief in place, but they take their stoves with them. The 106 isn't necessarily, kitted out for winter weather. And the 2nd Infantry Division didn't even, bury their commo wire, which showed you very much no one had expected anything in this sector.
That's fascinating. It's amazing. We can talk all you want about high technology, talk all we want about tanks, modern artillery, and of course, air power, supreme in World War II. But if your troops are shivering and wet and unsure of themselves, all the technology in the world probably isn't going to help. And I think that too, these are very basic explanations. Alexander the Great would have understood that explanation. Julius Caesar, Napoleon, all the way up to from the past to the present. It's interesting to me. And again, as a historian of World War II, I tend to get tech happy. I tend to want to talk about tanks, but basic care for infantrymen, an infantry column coming up, or as you say, doing what is always pretty complex. A relief in place is not the easiest thing in the world to handle or to admin. But boy, that admin, the level of admin you have often goes a long way toward determining the success you're going to have.
Well, and two sides of this I think are fascinating. One is this incredibly optimistic and aggressive German timetable, but that the Allies respond with is largely individual soldiers, small units, making do with what they have. So it's not about the most advanced technology, or in most cases about the decisions of the senior leaders or the officers above them. It's really a pretty tenacious fight. So, tell us, if you would you sketch out the German offensive itself? I know we leaped already into some of the American divisions, but kind of to set the stage for the audience.
Yeah, so there's 3 German armies which are assembled in the Ardennes. The weight of the assault is going to be on 2 of them. You mentioned the 6th Panzer Army, often going by the sobriquet, the 6th SS Panzer Army, since it tend to be based around SS units. I often think that, all the intelligence failures the Allies had in World War II and this one in the Bulge, if only they could have stuck a GPS in Sepp Dietrich's pocket, because wherever he was is probably where Hitler was going to be trying something dramatic. And it's been earlier than this. It's now in the Bulge. It's going to be in Hungary. There's a 2nd army that's going to bear the burden of the assault, and that's the 5th Panzer Army under one of the most aggressive German armored commanders of the war, von Manteuffel, a great old Prussian family. I'm a historian of Prussia, and I'm constantly struck by the families that are leading German armies in both world wars. They are not Johnny-come-latelys, and they were serving the Prussian kings a long time before they were serving the Kaiser or serving Adolf Hitler. So these roots run deep, and Manteuffel knows his way around a panzer assault, knows how to array his forces, knows how to hit with maximum impact. And in fact, his army will be the one that hits with maximum impact in the course of the battle. So 6th Panzer and then 6th SS Panzer in the north, 5th Panzer in the center. And then there's a kind of a defensive screening army in the south that's supposed to keep pace with the main assaults. That's the 7th. And it then sort of extend a defensive screen to protect the flank of the 2 attacking armies. You throw in some commando units, you throw in some German troops who are trained in the idioms of American English to break through the lines and sort of sow confusion behind the American lines and in the rear echelons. You have a small parachute drop on the von der Heit battalion, which the Germans haven't done really since Crete. There's been some tiny ones, but they haven't really done a paradrop since Crete. It's about as much of a package as the Wehrmacht could assemble by this point in the war. This is an army that's taken its lumps, and it's continuing to take its lumps on the Eastern Front, of course, while all this is happening. So it really does, I don't want to say wastes itself, but it really empties the cupboard. It empties the cupboard in order to launch this assault. One thing it really doesn't have, and if just let me say this too, Mike, because we've said what they do have, they don't have air power. This attack is not going to lead off with thousands of German planes in the sky sowing terror in the American ranks, and this is deliberate Hitler has said, and he said it to more than a few people in the fall, we have to be like the Soviets. We have to do what they did in 41. We had air power and they didn't. So they waited for bad weather. It's really amazing. The Germans, of course, used to be the supreme military force in Europe and are now admitting we're just going to have to, roll over and play dead and do what the Soviets did and just kind of hang on during the good weather and wait for bad weather. Of course, bad weather doesn't mean they get an advantage in the air. Bad weather just means nobody flies. And so there's no real air cover over German units in the Battle of the Bulge. But then again, the Allies can't fly for the first week or so either. And so that's seen by the Germans in 1944 as an advantage. And I think it says something about the wasting away of their strength in the previous couple of years.
Yeah, related to that, they assemble about 1,000 tanks for the lead echelons in this, which is an incredible number if you think, relatively, but they're also, the German Volksgrenadier divisions, arguably they're veteran officers and non-commissioned officers, but largely, folks scraped maybe from Luftwaffe or anti-aircraft units or, new conscripts with a heavy reliance on, automatic weapons, rather than trained riflemen. I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah, the Volksgrenadier divisions have always been a fascinating phenomenon to me and, frankly, a lot of other people as well. The regular German army, had been pretty much crushed in the Soviet Union. Think about Stalingrad. You lose an entire field army kind of senselessly. 300,000 men, a little under at the time that the encirclement was first made. And the battles have been bloody ever since. So what the Germans are doing in 44 is combing out the rear echelons. Now, that can mean administrative personnel, men working in supply columns. You mentioned, brand new conscripts, maybe get rid of the millions of men who just are lounging around in the Luftwaffe, as the Luftwaffe is now lacking planes, but certainly has a lot of men. And so they're used as well. So the manpower is uneven. They're even lightly wounded men combed out of the hospital. But let us admit, lightly wounded could be a very plastic definition in fall of and early winter of 1944. You could be missing a limb, in fact, as some troops in the Volksgrenadier divisions were. So you mentioned one thing, I think, couple of things that hold them together. And one is, veteran officers. There's no replacement for veteran officers and non-commissioned officers in getting even raw recruits up to snuff, to give an accounting for themselves on the battlefield. And that veteran officer is crucial. But secondly, these are troops who are not experienced, and they're going to need some help. And there's a larger percentage of automatic weapons, of machine pistols and machine guns in these Volksgrenadier divisions. So you don't know what to expect out of them. And that's something I'd like to address in the actual battle. But they may give a good accounting of themselves on the defense. They may melt away. They may launch a local counterattack with real elan, and you'd swear they've been in the field for 5 years, or they might just sit there and do nothing. And I think we see the Volksgrenadier experience. They're the spearhead, along with the tanks. You've got to have infantry accompanying the tanks. This is not the first infantry division, you might say. They all have high numbers, and that's usually assigned to in Germany that something, not is amiss, but that they're lacking something. They're not really the front echelon troops, but they're going to have to keep pace with the tanks. And if they don't, then the entire assault is doomed. And, without foreshadowing too much here, they give as good an accounting of themselves as you might expect. And that is to say, not quite good enough consistently across the field. So there are some local, the 106th Division, U.S., is largely, encircled by Volksgrenadier divisions. There are tanks certainly in the assault, and don't want to ignore that. But they give a pretty good accounting for themselves in that sector of the front in the opening days. 106, the regiments of the 106th U.S. Division were probably not deployed as carefully as they might be, of course, not expecting the assault they got. But I think in general, you have Volksgrenadier divisions who give up, just about what you'd expect. And that is to say that, they're not the elite troops of the German army. The elite troops of the German army are dead, probably in the Soviet Union, probably a year ago, as a matter of fact. We have to, I know this is happening in the West, but if you're you're in the staff, the German general staff, you know where the real action has been for the last couple of years. And of course, it's been on the Eastern Front.
Yeah, you certainly, Montgomery's, going to have, concerns about the lack of infantry in American divisions, as you try to continue this campaign. And I think in many respects, that's going to be one of the reasons why, not to presage too far ahead, why the decision is just to push the Bulge back rather than try to cut it off because of that shortage of infantry. And of course, the U.S. Army is going to do a similar thing as you described, comb the rear areas. There's going to be an opportunity for African-American soldiers to become fifth platoons, really as a sign of the shortage of experienced trained infantrymen. And, the combat casualty rates, for an infantry regiment by this stage of the war, 90 days in combat, an infantry regiment, might average 100% casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. And, the Hurtgen Forest, a couple weeks of combat, and the division needs 6,000 replacements. This is really the euphoria of the post-Normandy one aside. Suddenly you're up against some serious losses and some serious experience.
Those of us who've ever taught this material in undergraduate classes know that when you say there was over 100% casualties, some bright student will raise his hand, his usually, and say, how can that be? What does that mean? How can it? And you say, well, look, you get 40 replacements and then they're all killed. And you get 400 more replacements and they're all killed. And soon, you've drawn more replacements than your original complement of men. Mike, you're onto something here. And that's something else I'd like to say about the Bulge. There's been a reductionist tendency to talk about the U.S. Army's experience in World War II, both in Europe and the Pacific, and to attribute its considerable successes just to massive waves of firepower and massive supplies. There's the great scene in the movie Battle of the Bulge in which the Germans capture a U.S. supply column, and every man and every forward deployed U.S. soldier is getting his own Boston cream pie for Christmas. And the German officer says something like, well, this is why we're losing the war. But, there were plenty of times, and there will always be plenty of times when your troops are left to their own devices. It's bad weather. You're cut off from headquarters. It can be almost anything. And this is the U.S. Army fighting not from its traditional strengths, which, let's face it, massive firepower. No shame there. That's the Army I want to be in. I want to be in the Army with the massive firepower. I want to be in the Army that's well supplied. But it's not either one of those things in this particular battle, and especially those opening 2 weeks. I think of it's not so much the Army. I think of the Marines on Guadalcanal in the Pacific. They weren't fighting from prosperity. They weren't fighting out of abundance on Guadalcanal either. So there are plenty of times when U.S. fighting men in World War II had to do it on their own. And chances are better than not that they got the job done. And to me, this is what I like about the Bulge. You're cut off. The weather's horrible. Your supply running low. You have no anti-tank weapons at the moment. And you're looking at a Panzer IV or V rolling at you and what to do. And, just enough U.S. soldiers figured out what to do. A couple of tough defensive stands. You got two big German armies. We always say three, but I've already explained one of them is a defensive screen. You got two big German armies hurtling at you, and they've what looks like all the armor in the world. You mentioned 1,000 tanks, in the Ardennes. That looks like every tank in the world. If you see it coming at you on some narrow trail, you can dimly perceive it in the forest opposite the river you're on. That's a lot of tanks, and the Germans are coming at you, and just enough U.S. troops, made some very tough defensive stands. If I can get back to the German battle array, the 6th Panzer for all, people love the Waffen-SS. I hate to say that, but buffs of World War II are just obsessed with the Waffen-SS, these elite troops. Maybe some of them were elite. Some of them weren't so elite. They had a pretty horrible record of atrocity in combat. We can talk about that. I hope we will as well. But they certainly didn't look very elite in the Battle of the Bulge. They created one of the greatest traffic jams going forward against the Elsenborn Ridge that anyone's ever seen. Matter of fact, they're probably still sorting it out there in the Ardennes, trying to figure out who gets to get across this bridge first. And that has a lot to do with admin. SS troops were taught to attack. Well, let's first of all figure out exactly how we're all going to deploy this considerable strength and make sure that it's not trapped on a back road 30 miles behind. So it was a fiasco, and it was almost a solid hub-to-hub line of U.S. artillery, and so they didn't go anywhere. The screening force in the south, they made some progress. 5th Panzer under Manteuffel made the most progress. Actually broke free for a time, you might say, broke through the crust of U.S. defenders. Then they came, Saint-Vite and Bastogne. You need these towns. There's not that many crossroads in the Ardennes. You have to have these towns. And U.S. troops understood that and hung tough at a couple of places and blunted, as has been said 1,000 times, I can't take credit for this one, and I wouldn't, blunting the blitzkrieg in the Ardennes. And doing so in some of the toughest defensive fighting that anyone experienced in World War II. So thanks for letting me say that. I study the German army. People are enamored of its mechanized forces. Much of the German army strength, too, was some very, very tenacious infantry. And I think we can lose track of what World War II is all about if all we do is talk about tanks.
Yeah, no, and you're talking about the, first SS Panzer and Kampfgruppe Piper, and despite, people's attraction to them, they, in addition to the admin route control and managing that, they really don't conduct much reconnaissance, as they literally are running into American engineers and forces and looking, so I always thought, they don't do maintenance. The tanks invariably are broken down. They don't do flank security, logistics, kind of resupply, all these, what we would call these operating systems that collectively, the American Army at least is attempting to bring all these together in that process. And, ultimately they're going to abandon all their tanks and break out on foot. That doesn't sound like an armored spearhead, it's
a good German word, Daraufgänger, and it means like a guy who's just hell bent for leather. He's gonna drive forward as fast as possible. And I would say that's very much the SS's self-image. Reconnaissance, that's for weaklings. Supply, we'll figure it out along the way. Administration, who needs administration? It just slows us down. That's how the Allies fight. But I think World War II, and frankly, the study of any war carefully will tell you that what happens at the cutting edge is huge. Obviously, no one's going to say it's not important. But what happens at the cutting edge is often determined by what's happened in the rear echelons. How good your intelligence is. I'll give you an example. Kampfgruppe Piper, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, it's the Adolf Hitler Bodyguard Division. They're miles from the biggest Allied supply depot in Belgium at Stavelot. They could have fueled themselves and to the English, to the Channel Coast if they had managed to break through that far with the gas that they were sitting just miles from. And it's interesting to me that nobody had kind of spied that out. Nobody had really put an X on a map and say, hey, when you get to Stavelot, take your time because you're going to want to look at what's there. This, of course, gets us back to something I said earlier. The Germans are operating without air cover, and they didn't really do a lot. They couldn't do aerial reconnaissance because that would give away the surprise on which this entire campaign depended. You're not going to get to Antwerp if the Allies know you're coming. And so they hadn't really done I'm sure that a few reconnaissance flights said, boy, there's a lot of activity, vehicular activity around this small Belgian town. It indicates that there might be fuel there or something. I don't, but yeah. That never happened. And again, it's because the primary weakness of the German military array by 44, 45 is that the Allies don't just have air superiority; they have air supremacy. They can fly wherever they want, and bomb whatever they want, and no matter what you do, how much surprise you achieve, you're going to have a hard time overcoming that. But I think it has a lot to do with there is no reconnaissance. Germans traditionally under recon, and in this case, they couldn't do any more than that because they lack the aerial assets to do so.
Yeah, and then I just think it's interesting for the commanders on the battlefield don't try to make up for that absence of tactical intelligence.
It's funny, the Prussian tradition, going back a long way, is that, the king would ride forward. I mean, and when Frederick the Great rides forward on a personal reconnaissance, what he's telling every officer in his army is, you better be doing this too. If I can do it, if I can take the time to do it, you better all know what's ahead of you. And but I think that had kind of been lost. And I do think the Waffen-SS in particular, I think we can say this, had distilled some good lessons from war. That's, get a move on, be moving forward at all times. No lateral moves here. Let's make sure we're throwing down the field if this were a football metaphor. That's important, but there's a lot of other lessons that the Waffen-SS either didn't learn or completely rejected about the sort of cautious administration, reconnaissance, preparation you should do before you risk a single man in combat.
Let me kind of set the stage for, as they attack. The 6 SS Panzer is fortunate, if you will. They attack through the Losheim Gap, kind of in the flank between 2 U.S. corps on the edge of, the 106th Division. They're really spread out in this sector, so it wouldn't even have what we might consider a doctrinal frontage. And as Rob, as you said, the Volksgrenadier divisions will infiltrate and then surround 2 of the regiments. The 99th Division on the north flank is pushed north toward Elsenborn Ridge, and frankly, then with the other American infantry up there, the 1st Division and others, really cut off those routes. So very quickly, the German routes, you take away about 4 of them with that defense, and then south of the 106th is the 28th, and the Pennsylvania Guard Division coming out of the Hurtgen. But they've got a regiment on the road to Bastogne. Amazingly, that regiment's going to have like over 2,700 casualties out of a regiment of 3,200 soldiers. I mean, it's effectively destroyed, and the challenge there, though, is that you add days to the German timetable. I think that, the weather's bad, the terrain's terrible, all those things, but, the tenacity of these units, even the 106th Division holding out, those regiments held out longer than the German planners had assumed. And, it's certainly not a foreordained, piece there. I just thought that was pretty fascinating. And then real quick, let me hit, I think there's a couple big decisions that Eisenhower makes that influence the battle as we kind of see it unfold. And without these, it could be a very different outcome. Hence to your earlier point about, with hindsight, on the evening, so the Germans attack on the 16th, and plenty of confusion, throughout the Allied ranks of what's going on, what are the reports. But that evening, he's going to make his first decision. He takes the 7th Armored Division, which is up in Simpson's 9th Army, and dedicated south. And he takes the 10th Armored Division from Patton's 3rd Army and dedicates it north. Those two are really fundamental in both what's going to happen at Bastogne and then at St. Vith, which, without that extra armor, it's difficult to see how this campaign would have been as successful for the Allies. And then the next day, Eisenhower, largely by his intuition, because I believe Bradley's much more cautious and sees this as a much more local attack, he's going to commit his last reserve, which, for a commander to commit his last remaining reserve, the 18th Airborne Corps with the 82nd, the 101st, the 101st will race, en route. It's going to kind of divert it into Bastogne, and the 82nd will go north, really to hold these two kind of key intersections and flanks. And I think it's interesting, without those two decisions, you could have had a very different outcome. And I'd welcome kind of your thoughts on that, Rob.
So, here at the National World War II Museum, we like Ike. We are fans of Dwight David Eisenhower, and I certainly am. Look, you have to. We've already paid. I hope I've paid some tribute to the poor bloody infantry, out there in the field. But you also have to give a nod and a wink to Eisenhower. Everybody had told him this was impossible. And, instead of flying into a rage and firing every single officer he had, which, let us be honest, some commanders in military history would have done exactly that, Eisenhower takes a look around and he intuits something that a lot of people were telling him was wrong. Many people were saying, well, no, the Germans, all our intelligence, there's no way this can be a major offensive. This is a local counterattack. They're trying to straighten out their line or pick off a weak Allied division or whatever it might be. Eisenhower intuited somehow, no, this is the deal. This is the real deal. Something has to be done. Almost alone amongst his fellow officers and the staff and all that army of advisors he has around him, really, all telling him one thing. And he said, no, I just feel this. I feel it in my bones. I suppose a commander has a kind of a sixth sense. The Germans called it Fingerspitzengefühl, which, my students have loved over the years. It means that little tingly sensation you get in your fingertips when something exciting is happening, when something big is happening. And he rushes a couple of armored divisions forward. And then the next day, Mike, right on the theater reserve, the last uncommitted troops in his battle array. I mean, it's really quite something. 18th Airborne Corps, a couple of airborne divisions, and 101st, of course, probably making themselves most immortal of all the fighters in the Battle of the Bulge, the stirring defense of Bastogne. But we often say this about Eisenhower, Mike, and I know you've heard people say it. Well, not much of a tactical commander, not much of a battle guy, mainly good for making sure that the British and American officers under him didn't kill each other. Mainly getting between Patton and Montgomery. That's how people see Eisenhower. But this is one of those cases where I just beg to differ. And it's inexplicable, except to say that Eisenhower was a great commander, and he did what great commanders are able to do. Size things up with a single glance of his eye. Napoleon's, coup d'oeil, as he said, a single glance of your eye, a blow of your eye. You look at this battle situation and immediately you figure out what is happening and how you need to react to what is happening. And, 100% kudos to Eisenhower, because he flew against the advice of every intelligence officer on his staff, most of his colleagues. You said Bradley. I think there are probably some others we could name as well as saying, I don't think so, Ike. I don't know. That seems risky. They didn't think anything necessarily horrible was going to happen by rushing the 18th Airborne. They just thought Eisenhower was going to have egg on his face. He sort of overreacted. He got a little jumpy. He got, he had happy feet in the pocket, to use another football metaphor, right? And that would have been embarrassing for him. And he was willing to risk that as well. Your reputation, your dignity, your gravitas is a huge coin of the realm if you're an army commander. Yeah. He was willing to do that. And of course, like all great commanders, history proved Eisenhower right. So I just, a word for that. I do think that U.S. infantry and individual tank crews really showed their stuff in the Battle of the Bulge, but so too did the Supreme Commander. I think it's certainly one of his greatest battlefield moments.
Well, I agree with you. His contribution is holding the alliance together at the political level. And in this case, it's really, what's the term, the Augenblick,
Yeah.
In the blink of an eye, he senses this has to be done and acts. The other one I would add, you had infantry and armor, the engineers, the 7 engineer battalions in this that are committed early. They're like the last thing that Middleton has. The engineers, fighting as infantry in good engineer fashion. I think really those are some incredible, inspiring stories as you look at these engineer squads and teams and company strong points and in many cases really way above their weight class. The Germans had hoped for 6-1 advantage in many of these attacks, and in some cases marshal even more than that against some of these small American units. And you can see their anger when the Americans, either surrender or finally withdraw off that.
The Germans had once inserted virtually every pioneer battalion they had in their entire array, and that was in Stalingrad, to fight the last few hundred meters to the Volga. And they failed. I mean, they died in droves. It was quite the bloody battle. But just, that's another area where the Germans, they don't get a bridge down as quickly as they used to in the old days. They don't make crossings. They don't remove obstacles as quickly as they do. They've been outclassed in all those support functions. They're throwing every last man they can find, including some who had been lying in a hospital, into the infantry. And that's great. They're great. They give an accounting of themselves, there's no doubt, but it's those support functions that the Germans have completely failed in. They lost them in the fighting in the East, and they've never been able to replace them. And it's good because it's easy to look at a map and say, 2 German armies, and one has SS next to it. That must really be something. And they were something. They gave an accounting for themselves, but they're also lacking in that support function, things that don't really show up on a map, but I know professional officers study very, very deeply.
Yeah, and you're talking about the low level, infantry soldiers and others. One, I think, testament to this campaign, the United States will have 32 Medal of Honor recipients. both from the Ardennes and the associated Alsace campaign. And if you think of that, what an incredible number of, individual actions that produced that.
There's another number, of course, and it's 81,000, and that's the number of total casualties taken by the U.S. Army in the Battle of the Bulge. The biggest battle in the history of the U.S. Army, and it's going to usher in a very, very bloody, very short year of 1945, and it's almost a perfect curtain raiser on that horrible year. Mike, if I can pile on one thing you said there, and I would like to join you in it. You mentioned the big battles in Alsace. Operation Nordwind for the Germans, Northern Wind. It was supposed to be a companion piece to Operation Wacht am Rhein, this great offensive in the Ardennes. And together they would sweep the Americans out of their positions and again hopefully smash the Western Alliance, the total of those twin defeats. But Nordwind was another one. U.S. troops were caught by surprise, and some with their French allies as well, Free French fighting alongside. And the Germans managed to make some great progress, and just a handful of U.S. forces taking some very tough defensive stands, managed to sort of break the momentum of the Germans. And they aren't really feeding from the rear. The Germans pretty much put everything they had into the front line. They don't really have any reserves anymore. And American troops, again, in some heroic actions, managed to defeat Operation Nordwind. And it's funny, Battle of the Bulge, everyone knows it. My grandmother of sainted memory and me and everyone in between knows the Battle of the Bulge, but a handful of people know anything about Operation Nordwind. And in a book I wrote in 2017, when I first got to the museum, the Wehrmacht's Last Stand, I wrote about Operation Wacht am Rhein, wrote about the Bulge in detail from the German perspective, but also wrote a big meaty chapter on Operation Nordwind. And it's amazing. I've gotten a lot of commentary from veterans and veterans' families. My dad was in that, and he said nobody even knew about it, or people who did know about it didn't give a damn. But here's to the twin U.S. victories in late 1944 and early 1945 in the Ardennes and in Alsace.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of that campaign in Nordwind, the United States is going to commit nearly 230,000 troops into that battle, plus the 610,000 in the Ardennes. I mean, it's crazy.
Plus the last theater reserve, plus, if the Germans were giving it everything they got, you have to say, so were the Americans by this point in the war. There's a reason Americans will be remembering these battles for, I hope, as long as there's the United States of America. Not only the men who were badly wounded and who died, but just the entire heroism of the effort. At the beginning of World War II, there were a lot of people in the United States, even in the U.S. Army, who said, American boys, they'll never make fighting men. All they care about is going out on dates and playing with their cars. And you heard these tropes that American youth was soft and weak. George Patton sort of, that was his whole profane speech he'd give to the new recruits. Saying the F word every 2 seconds and SOB this and SOB that. He's trying to let them know, they're not home with mommy anymore. But I was never sure that was necessary. I think if the cause is explained to American troops, I think then, and frankly, I think now, explain to the American people. I think the Americans will defend the colors. I worked with young people for a year of my life. It was very dear to me. 2009, 2010 academic year. I was a visiting professor at West Point. And I met the young cadets, and people say, well, American youth are soft and don't want to defend the country anymore. Well, I beg to differ there, too, because I certainly met some of the finest young people in my entire life during my year at West Point. I think back a lot because that was, a lot of them graduated and went off to various wars in various places that America has been fighting in the 21st century, and even some casualties there as well. So again, I just don't want to wave the flag too egregiously here, but I think this trope about Americans being soft, I never believed it. It wasn't true then. It's not true now.
Yeah, no. Well, you certainly have to give an endorsement, about the young West Pointers, since my daughter's now, a recent graduate in the 82nd Airborne Division. But
I set you up for that, Mike.
You did. But there's kind of two parts of that. One was, everybody, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, all go to war against the United States in December 41, believing that trope you described. The Americans, too much jazz, they're corrupt, they're gangsters, they'll never amount to much, the potential is gone. And I think as you see this, it's very inspiring. It's you go, holy cow, in 2.5 years, not only do you build an army, but you build an army that ultimately is effective in this major battle. I think the other one is that, you remember the Why We Fight series, that the War Department, but they also did a survey of folks who hadn't seen it, and 90% of those soldiers, over 90%, could explain what would happen to freedom of religion, freedom of speech if Nazi Germany won. And so, to your point that the American soldiers do know what they're fighting for and actually have a degree of tenacity and resilience that was surprising to the enemies. It does seem that, some of the German units as they go into the Ardennes are expecting the American units to crumble immediately and are genuinely shocked by, what the resistance they face in that process. Now, that kind of leads me into, we talked about Comp Group Piper and, let's talk a bit about their atrocities. The 300 American POWs, not just the 80 some at Malmedy, but the others that they shoot, in addition to the, well over 100 Belgian civilians who are just, murdered as well. How do you see that?
I've already said a few things about the Waffen-SS, and I've studied the Eastern Front primarily in my own career, and they're nothing if not consistent. Murdering of civilians is part and parcel of their ethos. They're outlaw types. They've got a knife in their teeth and a skull and crossbones on their cap, and that's very much how they see themselves. They're bred. I don't mean this in the genetic sense. I mean in the training sense. They're bred to be brutal. They're bred to get as far forward as possible, as rapidly as possible. And you know what that means for taking prisoners? Because somebody's got to care for prisoners. And they've got to be herded back and blah, blah, blah. And it takes a lot of time. Of course, civilized people take prisoners and, feed them and make sure they're out of harm's way and to do the things that the Geneva Convention tells us to do. But thousands of years before there was a Geneva Convention, human beings still cared for prisoners in combat. Waffen-SS just, took all the bad examples from the past and sort of hoisted it on their flag. So even, I mentioned the Eastern Front, but even in the Western Front, soon after the Normandy landing at the Abbaye Ardennes, it was the massacre of the Canadians there. It's a place that anyone who visits Normandy should visit, a place where young SS troopers really, besmirched the profession of arms, I would say, for a lack of a better term. And of course, they're doing the same thing in this campaign, and the excuses are always the same. That we're told to get a move on, and that we can't dally around here and process these 80 Americans, and so let's take care of the problem in 2.5 minutes, which probably is how long it took to shoot 80 Americans at Malmedy and some of the others that other atrocities that you've named. Sure, let's get a move on. I understand that, but I also think there's no explanation. It's just cruelty. The Waffen-SS prided itself on being able to do things that lesser men would shrink from, including, murdering defenseless prisoners and murdering defenseless civilians. They're an interesting crew in that, they covered their battle flags with all sorts of honors. There's all kinds of things you could talk about in the Eastern Front, where the Waffen-SS seemed to have saved the day, and likewise, they fought very hard on the Western Front as well. No Germans would have gotten out of the Falaise pocket at all if it hadn't been for some heroic actions by the Waffen-SS. But at the same time, you more than make up for that. You more than get rid of that or help us forget that by the atrocities you've carried out. And so I just say, what happened in the Ardennes? Why were there atrocities? And my answer is it's more of the same. You put Comp Group Piper anywhere. And if there are civilians nearby or takes prisoners, similar things are going to happen. And Piper wasn't the only one. He's just kind of become the most famous or notorious one because it affected Americans. Yeah, no, I very much strikes me, this is very much a Nazi ethos, that Hitler expresses, cruelty impresses, and that there's a value of just being cruel, which on the battlefield actually, can boomerang on you. Now, when your units, are seeking quarter,
You know,
Yes, of course. You might say the Waffen-SS does this because then it prevents any other Germans from surrendering for the rest of the war. And, let's be honest, we're here amongst friends. The U.S. troops shot their share of prisoners as well. Some, probably most after what happened at Malmedy became known, but some before Malmedy. You take 1 million men and you put weapons into their hands and you put them under military discipline. Most of them will follow the rules as they're explained. There will always be some renegades, and certainly the U.S. military forces had their share as well. But never in U.S. military history was cruelty enshrined. This, I think, is a difference, and something we need to we need to bring out. Nowhere was cruelty enshrined.
And then even if we look at like the Volks Grenadier divisions attacking, 28th, there are some incidents there where prisoners are shot, but typically it seems that these are inexperienced troops that have been up in close quarters combat with another group, and the immediate tensions and anxieties are high. And in a number of cases, the officers then immediately step in and stop more than a few people. And so this is very different, though, than the first SS Panzer, where this is you're not in direct combat. You've actually separated yourself. You can't say it's the heat of the moment. This is a calculated brutality rather than, the challenge in combat as you're transitioning from close combat into someone surrenders and, inexperienced troops,
I've always explained this to my students. This is in World War I, and frankly, in every war that's ever been fought. Some lone machine gunner continues to pepper your lines with machine guns, and you see 5 of your buddies killed in the last 30 seconds. Then he suddenly throws up his hands and says, "I'm a prisoner now. I'm ready to surrender." And in the heat of the moment, often that guy who tries to surrender is killed. I think we have to be honest about that. It's been every war that's ever been fought. But there's there's a world that separates that from the Waffen-SS and the level Waffen-SS, the level of atrocity of many Wehrmacht units as well, but particularly the Waffen-SS. I try not to use the SS as the excuse for the nation. Everybody else was fine. It's just these SS troops gave us because a lot of people did a lot of bad things. Cooperating with the Hitler regime in some way, taking part in it, meant compromising your moral principles on some level, and some folks took it further than others did. But there's I never want to. I sometimes hear people try to give explanations for why Camp Group Piper killed the Americans at Malmedy, and frankly, I leave the room. I just don't see any point in it, and I don't see any sense in it either. I just think it's impossible to rationale.
And in the end, I think it completely boomerangs. Now, to hit your point earlier about, is it also a message to German soldiers? You look at the number of Germans who are killed, because they're not resolute enough in the final months of the war, but ultimately killed by, the party members.
The Wehrmacht's final retreat path from across the Rhine into central Germany and then across the Oder into central Germany from west and east. The Wehrmacht's final retreat path is littered with gallows poles, troops, the corpses of troops hanging from lampposts who have been shot or hanged, or sometimes both, by their own troops or by roving squads of SS men. Look, trying to surrender as a German in the last year of the war, it was a delicate operation. If you didn't do it quickly enough, the Americans would vaporize your village. With artillery fire, but especially they call in massive airstrikes. So if you didn't do it quickly enough, you fell foul of the Americans, who by late in the war, no one wants to be the last person killed in World War II. American troops would just shoot first and ask questions later, which frankly I think is pretty wise. But if you did it too early, and then somehow the Americans didn't quite launch the assault at the time you thought they were going to launch the assault, and now there's an SS squad in your town, you and your family and everyone in your neighborhood is about to be shot in the head. And it's an impossible situation. Max Hastings, a great World War II historian, we've had him at the museum many times. He wrote about the last year of World War II and called it Armageddon. I try to be aware of, especially biblical metaphors for what happened in World War II. I'm not sure they're appropriate, but Armageddon it was. It seemed in many cases as if all our civilizational restraints had been thrown off. And we're going a little, I guess, afield of the Battle of the Bulge right now, but it's where that discussion of Kampfgruppe Piper and the Malmedy massacre leads me. It's a bloodbath for everyone. The last 5 months in Europe, a bloodbath for everyone concerned.
Yeah, typically we like to think in many ways that the Battle of the Bulge is kind of the high point of the violence. And then it just kind of peters out and, the spring happens and the birds come out and the war's over. When in fact, the violence continues to escalate as the war continues until it ends. Then, of course, it's not just violence, but the casualties. And so,
so January, the Bulge finally, I guess you could say we flattened the Bulge by January. January and February see some of the toughest fighting in the history of the U.S. Army in the German Rhineland. It's that kind of gritty urban fighting that historians usually love, but for some reason are pretty much ignored here. Then there's the crossing of the Rhine in March, first at Remagen, and then this gigantic airdrop, plunder varsity across the northern Rhine in March. And then, there's this on into the heart of Germany and even, Western Czechoslovakia, the Chekhov, by the end of the war. The Soviets break out of the Vistula bridgeheads in January, conquer the eastern provinces of Germany. They've been German for 800 years, pretty much drive the civilian population out, get to the Oder, and then launch, the big drive into Berlin, one of the bloodiest battles in the history of mankind. So World War II, the casualties always blow my mind. In 1945, it's a short war, but let's just talk about Europe for a moment. We could extend this to Asia. About 30% of all German battle casualties, military casualties, happen from January 1st to April 30th, 1945. 4 months. 30% of the casualties. By definition, the Germans were in the war since 39, so they'd had 7 campaigning seasons, right? But 30% happening in that brief period. Likewise, the Soviets take about 20% of all their battle casualties in World War II, which are prodigious, as everyone knows, in the 4 months of 1945. So I can now safely make a second reference to Clausewitz, who notes, and he fought in the Napoleonic Wars virtually his entire life. And those wars just kept getting bigger and badder and bigger and badder. The battles, by the Battle of Leipzig, it was the biggest battle human beings had ever seen. And he posited that this is probably typical of big wars, of great wars, that they don't just kind of climax and then denouement and then peter out, that they just keep roaring until one side is literally smashed. And he would not have been, I guess, surprised at all about how World War II ended with this gigantic bloodbath.
Yeah, certainly. The theoretical is that the wars are going to take that path towards total war. And I think, that's an important kind of piece is, if we look at American combat casualties in the Bulge, not to mention, frostbite and weather and sickness, it's about 10% of the combat casualties just in that month. So you still have, a long way to go before. It also, I think, underscores that there's this sense about how does this war end? We've been, surprised here in the Bulge, and what is it that we have to do ultimately to finally destroy the German war-making machine, liberate these oppressed peoples, set the conditions for the post-war.
It's interesting to me, Mike, we're talking about these last 5 months, but if I can just go back in time a bit, I think the way the war ends, Clausewitz, but of course Clausewitz wasn't there. Both sides have a strategy, and Roosevelt enunciated the Allied strategy after the Casablanca conference would be unconditional surrender. And Goebbels enunciated the German strategy right after the Battle of Stalingrad, after the final demise of Sixth Army, February 1943. Totaler Krieg, he called it. Total war. We'll never surrender. Fight to the end. Every last man, woman, and child in Germany. That's what they said. And so you have an irresistible force, and that's the Allies, this gigantic military force, and they're not going to stop. No negotiations, no quarter. And the Germans are saying, no surrender. We're going to fight to the last man. And so what you see in 1945, besides the immense human tragedy, is the fascinating theoretical interplay of two diametrically opposed strategies. Given those two strategies, it's impossible to see how things could have gone any different. Some less bloody resolution to World War II. If one last thing about those strategies, both enunciated at almost exactly the same moment. The end of the Casablanca Conference is January, and Goebbels gives his famous total war speech at the Sportpalast in February. At the time, neither party thought they were really winning the war. The Germans had just senselessly sacrificed an entire field army at Stalingrad. The Allies were stuck in Tunisia, long way from Germany, and their merchant marine was being shredded by U-boats. It's as if from the depths of that, both sides decided to make an extreme statement about what they were fighting for in this war. Of course, the Allies managed to prevail, but it's a horrible ending to the war.
Well, and even, you talk horrible, Goebbels, the mobilization of the Volkssturm, all the teenage boys, the casualty rates among them.
They got chewed up. I always say Hans and Opa in the same battalion. In other words, little boy and his grandfather in the same battalion, given rudimentary training, handed a Panzerfaust, one-shot anti-tank weapon, and sent out to go hunt T-34s. I mean, Hitler did a lot of immoral things in his life, clearly. He's the architect of the Holocaust. We could stop there. But one of the many immoral things was mobilize children and throw them into the line. They were chewed up. And frankly, we'll never know the casualties that the German Wehrmacht took by the end of the war. The records were lost. They're in many ways, partial estimates. Some very good historians have devoted their lives to bringing some precision, and, progress has been made. But I don't think we'll ever know how many kids died in the defense of Pomerania.
Yeah, as they're defending their towns, of course, they're not in uniform, so they're shot as partisans or, run over or even shot by the SS because they weren't stout enough. So,
you see photos at the end of the war, and as American troops, look well-fed, husky, or Soviet troops likewise, and they've captured some, Hitler Youth, and almost invariably, these boys are crying. Almost invariably. It strikes me how often I see that same photo. They've been unable to process what they've just been through emotionally. How could they? They're children.
Well, and we're talking about casualties. You said, the Americans have over 80,000 casualties in the Bulge. I think the German numbers are, somewhere between 80 and 103,000 are the numbers I see as well. So it's not like, there's some incredible ratio of difference. In this case, it's really incredibly casualty, producing for both sides.
I think, Mike, you have this kind of very close range battle. You're in the forest. In 1940, the German panzers just drove through the Ardennes against negligible opposition, handful of Belgian defenders. This time they tried to fight their way through. And after a shaky beginning for the Americans rushed enough reinforcements. There'd been a big battle in the Ardennes in World War I as well. The big, gigantic, close-range battle, multiple field armies on all sides. And it was a casualty producer. I think one thing about forest battle, these kind of battles, artillery round goes off in the forest, and who knows how many people it kills as the splinters, get shot hither and yon. So it's just the dark Ardennes has taken its toll of many, many, many field armies going all the way back to the Romans. Romans were terrified of the Ardennes. They found it's kind of a ghost forest. You could hear the whispers of the past soldiers who died in the Ardennes. And, we don't really believe those sorts of things anymore. We have a scientific view of reality, but in a way, the Romans were right.
Yeah. You're talking about the intuition and the feel. Do you have that feel?
Yeah, that's right.
So Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge, quote, the greatest American battle of the war, unquote. What do you think of that?
Sure. I'll give Sir Winston that one. I think he's right on the money. A lot of great battles. If your loved one or your buddy died in another, you might say, well, why are we forgetting that one? I know there's working at the museum, people always want to say, what was the biggest? How many numbers? What is the best? What was the most decisive? But certainly the Americans answered a lot of questions at the Battle of the Bulge, even a lot of perhaps put to rest a lot of self-doubts about whether they really rated as a top-notch fighting force. And I don't think frankly, I think by the time we get to the Ardennes, I think the question is silly. I think they'd proven it many times over, but nevertheless, those allegations still arise. And certainly after December, after the end of 1944, no one could ever say the Americans can't fight modern war. You attack them at your own risk. You catch them flat-footed, maybe you get a few days of advantage. Once they get their feet under them, and then they call upon not only the immense tenacity of their infantry, but the immense levels of firepower on land and in the air, you're toast. Or at the very least, you're in big trouble fighting the Americans. I think the Germans learned that. And look at the American performance going forward out of the Bulge, across the Rhine into Germany. As I say, this is not easy fighting. The Rhineland is one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. It's combat in a built-up area, or whatever the current phrase is, but it's combat in a built-up area on steroids. It's one urban area after the other. The Americans, get through it. Conbrio, they blast their way across a river. They drive not only across Germany and separate northern from southern Germany. They actually drive into Bohemia, that is, into the Czech regions of Czechoslovakia. Prague. It's really something. Yep.
I think related to that, certainly the ability to the infantry, the armor, the artillery, the integration with tactical air, all those come together. The ability of the logistics to keep pace with the speed of the attack, casualties, aid stations, all those are pretty incredible as you think through those. And that's an aspect that. In many ways, it shows how mature the American Army had come. If you take its path from Kasserine, it had a lot to learn. But ultimately, the force, in many ways, is getting better, despite the casualties, which is interesting. The German units, their infantry units are less effective than they were, say, in 1940 or 41. I think arguably the American units are, as a general rule, are increasingly much more effective than they were, when they first entered combat in North Africa.
I don't think there's any doubt. I think Kasserine needs to be looked at pretty carefully. They were a disastrous opening, and nobody can. I don't care how people explain it away. The opening of Kasserine was disastrous for the Americans. They righted themselves, and Rommel even was pretty impressed by the end. But yeah, absolutely, the fighting qualities of U.S. small units in particular, their ability to combine arms between infantry and artillery and to call in the airstrike at just the right moment. It's really, really quite impressive with the armor support as well. But, all the way up the chain of command, American Corps commanders were a lot better in the campaign in Germany than they've been anywhere. One thing I think we have failed to mention yet, the encirclement of an entire German army group in the Ruhr under Field Marshal Model. That is a big attacking pincer in the north, and a big attacking pincer in the south, linking up behind, taking 350,000 prisoners or something. Who knows exactly how many Germans were in the Ruhr pocket in 1945. But that kind of thing, coordinated drives, heading towards one another, potential for blue on blue fire, are all the reasons that American troops tend not to encircle their adversary. They're really firepower intensive units, and it's a very delicate operation. But they certainly did it in style in the Ruhr. And that, to me, is something else. You got Eisenhower, you got the men in the trenches, but those middle level, those operational level commanders, I think really gave a good accounting for themselves in the German campaign. And that's, I think, lessons that were also learned in the Bulge.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And you mentioned prisoners, 23,000 Americans will become POWs in the Bulge. But in contrast, very quickly, you're taking hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, yeah. And the scale. You think about, the greatest battle of the war. Sometimes we think of D-Day, 170,000 Allied troops land in 24 hours. Fast forward to the Bulge, it's over 600,000 in combat. 20 infantry divisions, 10 armor divisions, 3 airborne divisions. I mean, it pales even the D-Day piece. How do you even sustain those and keep them in the field and supplied and medical support? I mean, just that alone is an incredible feat.
If I may call, you said 20-some thousand prisoners. Probably the most famous one, a young guy named Kurt Vonnegut. who would go on to become a very famous author and wrote anti-war novels. Slaughterhouse-Five. He was taken as a prisoner to Dresden, kind of witnessed the firebombing of Dresden, and then was one of those U.S. POWs detailed to carry corpses out of buildings, which must have completely changed the course of his life and images that were with him till his last dying breath, I'm certain. But Slaughterhouse-Five, Schlachthaus 5, was a real place. It seems like you're reading a fantasy, and of course, Billy Pilgrim is coming unstuck in time, and he's moving from place to place and time to time. It is a science fiction novel, but parts of it are all too real.
He's one of the infantry soldiers in the 106th Division.
Yes,
in those two regiments on the Schneefeld that are ultimately surrounded and will surrender.
Right. So this, I remember, like millions of other people, reading Slaughterhouse-Five and being particularly affected by it. And there's, you say, what is the impact of the Battle of the Bulge? And one of the soldiers there was taken prisoner, and then later came home and wrote a great, and so these horrible things. Later came home, wrote a novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. And so you're still reading about the Battle of the Bulge, even if you don't know you are when you read Slaughterhouse-Five.
Well, so it's a good point. 80 years on, why does the Battle of the Bulge still matter? How do we reflect and learn from World War II? But there's aspects you mentioned like Slaughterhouse-Five that still resonate, even if we don't necessarily understand the context.
Yeah, I'll just say something, and maybe with a bit of an eye towards current events. In World War II, Americans from all over the country were thrown together into this gigantic military machine. There were country boys and city boys, and Catholics and Protestants and Jews, and the black and white and brown, and every possible permutation of America. And those Americans in that military force learned to trust one another, knew they had each other's back no matter what was happening. And I always get a little nervous about World War II. The country was united and we were all together, and we're a fractious place. There were a lot of people who had disagreements on strategy, on wages, on living conditions in World War II. So let's just stipulate we're a fractious people. But I think World War II is an inspiring example of what happens when Americans, do pull together. And, we live in fractious, maybe even hyper-fractious times today, it seems, when I travel around the country and talk to many people. But at the bottom, we're all Americans, no matter where we came from. You're a citizen, you pay your taxes, you obey the laws, you're as good an American as anyone else. And I think a lot of people learned that in World War II. A lot of people, Northerners and Southerners just hadn't really been mixing much. They still had all kinds of ideas about one another from the Civil War, I'm certain. My dad, came from Italian immigrant, Cleveland, Ohio. And then, he had, I remember him saying the Southern, the Southern sergeants in boot camp, just wanted to murder her. But he said gradually he learned to realize that the kind of things they pounded into his head, his non-soldierly head, really helped keep him alive in the course of World War II. So that's, those are lessons that we can all learn. And we're all Americans, and get out and talk to your fellow Americans, socialize with them, because millions of soldiers had to do just that in World War II, and they learned to do it, and it made the country a better place.
Yeah, so it didn't matter if it was a regular Army or a National Guard division. By this stage of the war, all their replacements just come from America. And so
yeah, that's right.
You might have started as a, Bedford, Virginia, or,
My dad was in the Americal division.
There you go.
In the South Pacific.
23rd Infantry Division.
And he mixed with a lot of people from a lot of places that he'd never met before, and a lot of places he'd never been, and a lot of places probably never would be. But I think Americans got a sense of what their country was, that it wasn't just your little local, it's not just your town or your city or your neighborhood in a big city, but it was this gigantic sea to shining sea kind of thing that really could be a hope to mankind. There's some inspiring words that American leaders have spoken over the years. We haven't always lived up to them, but I think by and large in World War II, we did live up to them. One of the reasons I loved working at the museum so much, got to sort of talk about World War II to ordinary people who didn't often know that much about it, Mike. I think if we, not to insult our audience, but I think it's true. They often would say, but I had no idea that was true. And I always felt that we were really doing good work at the museum and sort of reminding people of what had happened now some 80 years ago.
Yeah, I think the achievement, one, the casualties are so incredibly huge that it's difficult to understand. But it's also difficult to understand even the achievement, of putting together these forces, training them, deploying them, making them effective. And then, frankly, the actions of everyday Americans, small unit leaders. There's incredible inspiration in that, where you see, here's everyday people, not just, thrust in to meet people they haven't met from different parts of the country, but they actually, step up and really achieve some things that are incredibly awe-inspiring for me. As you go, wow, how was that possible? Let alone, one, it's you're fighting, not just the Nazi war machine, but you're also fighting the elements at the same time. In the comfort of an office, you don't always think about, the Siberian low and the temperatures that they're enduring as well, that really would sap your strength and your tenacity. To see what America and Americans can do, I think is really quite incredible. For the Army, this is the largest single battle in their history. So many units have links to this. I think it's even, today as we think about, transitioning our military or lessons there, there's lessons, from what Americans did 80 years ago that I think can really serve as a touchstone for us as well.
Yeah, Mike, I think, there's history, what happened, but there's also heritage, why these things mean something to us today. And I think the Battle of the Bulge is awash in a lot of both.
Rob, it's always great to engage with you and really benefit from your incredible insights. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the Bulge and really to share your wisdom.
Mike, it's always great to be with you. Call me anytime.